I'm Amanda Lamb. I'm a reporter here at WRAL TV, and I have covered the issue of domestic violence for 25 years since I started in this business. At WRAL, I concentrate on crime reporting, so I cover many, many cases that involve domestic violence. I've also been a volunteer with many organizations involving domestic violence and sexual assault. 913. That's a very big number. That's almost 1,000. That's the number of domestic violence homicides we had in North Carolina since 2002. And that's just since the North Carolina Coalition has been cataloging that. So the number is obviously much higher. Between April 2011 and March 2012, the North Carolina Council for Women received nearly 5,000 referrals regarding domestic violence issues. So again, it's a huge problem. It's a problem that, like I said, I've been covering for 25 years, and yet victims are still afraid to come forward. And that's what this is about. This is about creating awareness, and this is about creating a statewide initiative where we can all connect and communicate and continue a conversation that's been going on for a long time, but we still need to keep talking about it. I have the privilege of introducing our esteemed panelists tonight, and I'm going to try to do it in order, and if you'll just come up and take your seat as I introduce you. First, we have George York Jr. He's the president and CEO of York Properties Incorporated. He has over 20 years of experience in various roles in the company. He's won multiple awards in the business community, including being voted one of the 24 most influential people in downtown Raleigh in 2008 by Raleigh Magazine. Besides his involvement with many professional and civic organizations, he's also very active in the community. He's volunteered with Interact of Wake County and the Domestic Violence Task Force, roles that directly relate to the goals of the Enough campaign. He graduated from Wake Forest University and the Keenan Flagler School of Business. He's married to Parker York, and they have 3 boys, ages 2 to 11. Thank you for joining us tonight, George. Appreciate it. Going to go right down the line here. Next is Representative John Faircloth. He's in his 2nd term. He's filed as a candidate for a 3rd term representing Guilford County. He's served and protected citizens for nearly 40 years, first as a member of the United States Army Reserve, also the Greensboro Police Department, and then as chief of police for both cities of Salisbury and High Point. He was elected to the High Point City Council, serving as mayor pro tem, and worked for many years for the North Carolina Department of Justice. Speaker Thom Tillis has appointed Representative Faircloth to chair the Appropriations Subcommittee on Justice and Public Safety. He also serves the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on Justice and Public Safety. He's a successful realtor who's active in the community and his church. He's married with 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Next in line is Jennifer German. She serves on the board of Interact, Wake County's only provider of domestic violence and sexual assault services. Jennifer first became involved with Interact as a client and then served as a volunteer and now as a member of the board. As a survivor herself, Jennifer is an outspoken advocate for victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Jennifer is married with 2 sons and a stepdaughter and 2 step-grandchildren. She resides in Fuquay Arena and works full-time as an analyst for Duke Energy. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Our next panelist is Creighton Blackwell. He's the Vice President of Branch Networks and Community Engagement at Coastal Federal Credit Union. He also has extensive community service experience serving on nonprofit boards, which include Triangle Family Services, the Orange County Partnership for Young Children, North Carolina Jumpstart, the Business Advisory Council of Durham Public Schools, the Caring Community Foundation, and the YMCA. He's a graduate of the Leadership North Carolina program and currently serves as the chairperson for the Morrisville Innovation Foundation. He's a contributor and partner with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Creighton is a graduate of the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill and is married with 3 children. Welcome, Creighton. Thank you. Holly Oxendine. There she is. Holly is a Lumbee Indian and a native of Lumberton, where she resides with her husband, Lee Oxendine. She's currently employed with Southeastern Family Violence Center, where she serves as the court advocate. Holly, like many others, has lived through a domestic violence relationship, and today she does not see herself just as a survivor, but as an overcomer who uses her past as a compelling force to thrive. She believes in the statement by George Eliot, quote, "It's never too late to become what you might have been." Thanks for being here tonight, Holly. Appreciate it. And now one of my friends and colleagues who I've interviewed for stories on this issue, John Gard, is an investigator with the Pitt County Sheriff's Office in Greenville, North Carolina. The majority of his career has been spent specializing in the response to and investigation of domestic violence cases. As a sergeant of the Domestic Violence Prevention Unit, he was instrumental in examining the impact of judicial changes on domestic violence cases and developing innovative responses to offender accountability. Gard has over 21 years of law enforcement experience in North Carolina. He's the past president of both the North Carolina Victims Assistance Network and board of directors for the Center for Family Violence Prevention. He also served on the North Carolina Child Fatality Task Force. Welcome, John. Thank you for being here. Now, we're going to go down the line and ask questions, but feel free at any time. This is a conversation. If you guys want to jump in and add to what somebody else has said, please feel free. Representative Faircloth, I'll start with you. Obviously, you've had a long experience in law enforcement in North Carolina. In your mind, when an officer is dispatched to a domestic violence call, what is their first response? What do they think about when they walk in that door, when they get to that scene?
Well, let me go back and talk about the first time that I went to a domestic situation as a young police officer. And obviously, I had no idea at that point what I was going to. I'd never done it before. I got the call over an old radio we had back then that would reach about 2 blocks. And when I got to the call, went up and knocked on the door, and this man came to the door and said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, we've been called, there's some problem going on here." And he slammed the door in my face. And I had about 6 months experience at that time, so I backed away, went back to the car and called for help. Now, after I had had that experience many times, I began to realize that every time I got that call over that radio, it had a little bit different effect on me than any other kind of call I got. Because I knew when I got there, I was going there supposedly to help somebody, but I was probably going to end up as an adversary to 2 people who were mad at each other and now were mad at me. So it's a different type of call than virtually any other call that a young officer gets, I think, and takes a lot of conditioning and, thank goodness now, good training to react properly.
And things have changed. And John, you're on the front lines handling these types of cases. How do you think things are different today? I mean, what happens now when one of your officers or you respond to a call like this?
Well, I think it's important to expand on the training issue. Back when I went through the academy, there was not training specific to how to respond to domestic violence. That didn't take effect until the year 2000. So that's one key component. But I think it is the evolution internally within the criminal justice system and officers specifically that now we do have an understanding that the dynamics of this issue is different than in any other crime. And it takes not only dedication, smarts, and the drive to do the right thing. Know that there are certain techniques we as law enforcement officers can utilize to get to the truth, increase victim safety, as well as offender accountability.
Holly, what are you seeing in your area in terms of the types of people who are seeking help from your agency, and how do you respond?
Well, of course, in our area, we have about a 68% Native American population. So 68% of the population is Native American. So most of the individuals that do seek assistance from us, probably from 44 to 48%, are Native Americans. But not just women, which we all know women, it's the stereotype that only women are abused. But we're starting to see a lot more men. They're becoming a little bit more vocal about what they're going through, and also a lot of elder abuse. So I would say it's pretty much diverse, but of course the majority of the individuals that we see are females. And our main service that we offer at Southeastern Family Violence Center, of course, is our shelter. But we're seeing a lot more, like an increase in individuals seeking protective orders. Even if they don't follow through with it, they are at least, attempting that. And we know that usually a woman will leave someone 7 times before they actually decide, okay, I'm done. I'm going to be, done completely. So.
Well, that's a staggering statistic. Thank you, Holly. Jennifer, you've had firsthand experience. Obviously, you work with Interact and you use your personal experience to help others who are in this situation. Can you share a little bit with us about your background and how you use that experience to help others?
Sure. Thank you for including me on the panel, first of all. I'm really happy to be here. My story isn't really all that different than a lot of other stories. What I'd like everyone to know is that I grew up in a loving home, and my parents have been married for now over 50 years, and I had a wonderful childhood. So there was nothing sort of out of the ordinary about my upbringing. But my story does begin like many others. I met a man, we dated for a year, we got engaged, and we were married a year later, and I was in love and very happy. And there were probably, looking back, a lot of red flags, warning signs that I missed during our courtship and our marriage. Probably I overlooked them, or maybe I was in a bit of denial about really what was happening, and at times how bad it really was. He was extremely jealous and possessive. He was verbally abusive, called me names. He would fly into rages. It's very stereotypical Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type of situation. And he would explode, and we'd have this altercation, and then things would get better, and the cycle would repeat. It wasn't until our first child was born that things really started to escalate, which seems ironic because a time that should be filled with joy was actually very tense. I remember the first Christmas Eve, after my first child was born, we had an argument because I wanted him to stay home and spend time with me and the new baby, and he wanted to go spend time with his friends. I locked myself in the bedroom, and he broke down the door, lunged across the room, grabbed the baby from me, and wouldn't give me back my child until I just begged and pleaded for him to do that. I look back on that time, and I can see now what I couldn't see then. Sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees when you're in that situation. And I guess things just escalated over time, and something that had been years in the making, one evening in March of 2006, he attacked me. And that was when I realized that my life was in jeopardy and that my children and I would not be safe unless I left that situation. And that really began the journey for me from being a victim to being a survivor.
Thank you for sharing that. And Jennifer's story is something that it could be anybody. It could be our neighbor, it could be our friend, and it could be somebody in the workplace. George, talk a little bit about why, as a business owner, why is this issue important to you? What do you look for in terms of your employees and trying to reach out to them?
Right. Well, domestic violence and abuse, it definitely crosses the border into the workplace. Oftentimes, as the woman has left, one of the only places that she can be located by the batterer or by the abuser is at the workplace. They also receive many phone calls, threatening phone calls, arrive at work late, leave work early, absent from work. I mean, there are all sorts of issues that tie into domestic violence and how it overlaps with the business that we run. Fortunately, I don't, I may have missed signs, but I haven't seen it in my office, but statistics would say it's happened and I've missed it. It is it's very common, it's very private generally, but it certainly can spill over into the workplace.
So it
That's-
sounds
yeah.
like something we need to talk about in terms of business, members of the business community to talk about this issue.
Right, it's hard, you know, you hear, you know, had the pleasure of hearing Jennifer speak a few times. It's hard to talk about domestic violence as a bottom line issue, as a business issue, when you hear these, the stories of heroic survival, you know, going on. But if you can separate yourself from that and look at it as a business issue, it costs billions of dollars in healthcare costs, in mental health costs, in absent employees, in underproductive workers, in absenteeism. I mean, it's just a staggering amount of money. So, you know, maybe that is a way to connect to some businesses as opposed to the emotional side of things.
Right, it may be a way to start the conversation with some people that would otherwise not be inclined to talk about it.
Sure.
Creighton, obviously financial issues, that's your background, that's your bailiwick, you instruct people on these issues. Talk a little bit about the economic impact that domestic violence has in the community.
Well, and to start off, I want to tag into something that George was just speaking about. Because when you have such absenteeism, what also happens with that is you see job loss. You see that be affected, and all of a sudden now that lack of income leads to you not being able to pay a mortgage, not being able to pay your bills, what then goes directly into exactly what I do and what I've seen, which is the financial standpoint. How does that affect your credit? How does that affect your buying power? The everyday things that you need to think about when you're talking about your money and how you do that. And that's been my responsibility from my job for the past 17 years. And what really brought me to this is I remember sitting in my office when I first started as I was a branch manager, and I had repeated, it was 3 times in 1 week, where I had someone come to me needing a loan, needing help of some sort, because they needed to get out of a situation.
And, you know, that's interesting because that's, I think, one of the main things that I've heard in my reporting. And Holly, what's your experience with that? When women come to you and say, I can't leave because, is money one of the number one things?
I would say it's near the top. One of the things that we focus on at Southeastern Family Violence Center is a program called New Choices, New Directions, which talks about financial abuse and talks about the financial component of the actual abuse, because some people don't think that that actually ties in. But it's a driving force in whether or not an individual wants to leave or whether they stay. A lot of people would rather stay in an abusive relationship than to be homeless. Or, you know, maybe the perpetrator is the actual, not necessarily the breadwinner, but they've kind of taken control of their mind, and they've convinced them that even though you are financially, you know, stable within yourself, that without me you can't survive. So it does play a factor, and that's one of the things that we have been trying, especially this year, to focus on, so that individuals not only know that there is physical abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, but that there is a financial component to that, and it really just ties it all together.
Right. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but Representative Faircloth, let's go back to law enforcement, because I think, you know, obviously they are on the front lines of handling this issue. Talk about training. How important is it to train officers to deal very specifically with domestic violence situations?
You know, law enforcement training has had an evolution since the 60s and 70s. It's hard to think back to the fact that in North Carolina, prior to 1971, there was no state-mandated training for law enforcement officers. There were no state-mandated standards for hiring law enforcement. In many cases, somebody would just walk in and say, I need a job. He'd get a badge and a gun, and they were all he's back then. Times have really changed. We now have, starting in the 70s with new legislation, the training system was set up in North Carolina. It started out small with about 30 hours, 35 hours. Now it's a very extensive program, and a major part of that training is dealing with domestic situations and sexual confrontations. And I'm glad to say that the officers today, when they walk out of their academy, wherever it may be, they are much better able to understand what they're going to be facing out there, and therefore much better able to handle it.
John, talk a little bit about what your agency does in terms of domestic violence. I know that you've had some special programs, some grants, and also maybe what we're doing right and what we need to do better.
Well, I think North Carolina has made a lot of progress over the years, and it's things we should be proud of, but by no means are we anywhere close. When we look at the programs that the Pitt County Sheriff's Office has set up over the years, everything has been established based on knowns when it comes to the issue of domestic violence and or sexual assault. We look at one of the more recent programs right now is looking at leveraging pretrial release conditions after an arrest to increase victim safety and offender accountability. And prior to that, we really focused on the witness intimidation component. We realize, and this is a known, I mean, we experienced a drop from an 86% conviction rate to a 36% conviction rate after one change in case law. We realize that offenders, their modus operandi today is to facilitate the victim's absence in court just to escape accountability. And what is sad, but I think we're making progress on, is sometimes the victim isn't just fighting the offender or the abuser. They're fighting society's views, the myths surrounding this issue, and even those of us who are allied professionals within the criminal justice system, we also buy in, because we are an extension of society, we buy into those myths as well. So although I'm very proud of the state and the training issues we've done, I think we do need to revisit and look at what the studies have shown us to this point. What are the known behaviors? And it could be things as simple as this. Domestic violence is a cycle. It could be nothing more than an officer on the scene after they get to the part of, can you tell me why you called, to say, okay, before today, when was the last time you were hit, kicked, punched, shoved, grabbed in a way that made you feel pain or discomfort? Because we know it's a cycle, and that could lead us to additional accountability for that offender. So I think we need to re-intensify our effort on this. I do strongly believe that all failures, at least within the criminal justice system, can be tied to one of two things, and that's typically lack of training and or lack of communication.
Thanks, John.